The morning they taped that neon orange violation notice to my boat dock, I was halfway through my second coffee. From my living room, I saw Karen, yes, the Karen of the Lakeview Shores HOA, marching down the slope in her oversized visor and clipboard like she was leading a SWAT raid. She didn't even look up at the security camera I'd installed last year after her last stunt with the mailbox paint color. I knew she'd cooked up something ridiculous again. I stepped outside, coffee in hand. "Karen, what's the emergency this time?" She didn't even pretend to be cordial. "Your dock violates Section 12, Paragraph 4. It's non-compliant with updated community standards. You'll need to dismantle it by Friday." Updated standards? Since when? The board voted last week. It's retroactive. Your dock's 30 inches too long and the railing is non-standard. "We sent out the newsletter." "You mean that newsletter you dropped in 2 driveways and called it good?" Karen huffed, flipping through her clipboard. "It's your responsibility to remain informed. Failure to comply will result in daily fines starting at $100. I laughed, but she was dead serious, and I knew from experience she loved handing out fines. Last year, she tried to fine me for planting tomatoes in my backyard, claimed it disrupted the visual flow of the neighborhood. I squatted by the dock, running a hand along the wood I'd stained myself last summer. My son helped me build it. 12 hours of sweat and splinters. It was my escape, my fishing spot. And Karen wanted it gone because it didn't match her vision of lakefront uniformity, whatever that meant. I wasn't about to roll over. That night, I pulled the community bylaws from the drawer. Karen loved quoting them, but I'd actually read them cover to cover during my first run-in with the HOA. Turns out, the updated standards she mentioned, they weren't officially recorded yet. She'd pushed them through in a closed-door meeting without notifying the full board or the homeowners. Illegal, plain and simple, but here's where it gets interesting. While digging through public property records, I stumbled on something wild. The HOA technically didn't own the dock at the clubhouse. It was listed under a private holding company that had gone bankrupt last year. The land under it reverted back to the city, and the dock itself was now listed for sale under a quiet auction. No one else had bid. I stared at the screen for a full minute, then I placed my bid, and won. 2 weeks later, after a whole circus of paperwork and a very satisfying notarization, I legally owned the HOA's precious clubhouse dock. I waited until a sunny Saturday afternoon, when the HOA board was hosting their usual overpriced wine and cheese mixer on the water. Karen was mid-toast about preserving the beauty of Lakeview Shores when I pulled up in my truck, backed it up to the dock gate, and calmly installed a bright red private property sign. Then I padlocked the entrance. Karen stormed over, heels clacking against the planks. "Peter," she shrieked. "What do you think you're doing?" I held up the deed. "Just enforcing my property rights. You understand that, right?" "You can't do this." "I can. You banned my dock, so I bought yours." Her face went red. People were staring. One of the HOA board members dropped his wine glass. "You have no idea who you're messing with," she hissed. "Oh, I think I do." And that's when it got really fun. The Monday after I locked the dock, my phone rang before sunrise. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail, then played it on speaker as I poured my coffee. "This is Charles Kincaid, legal counsel for the Lakeview Shores Homeowners Association. You are hereby ordered to remove all barriers and signage from the community dock immediately. Failure to comply will result in civil litigation." I took a sip. Predictable. About an hour later, someone started hammering on my door hard enough to rattle the hinges. I opened it to find Karen and a man in a navy blue blazer with a briefcase under one arm and sweat already forming at his temples. He didn't bother introducing himself. "You've unlawfully deprived members of a shared community asset," he said, flipping open a stack of papers, "and the board demands access be restored immediately." I leaned against the doorframe. "You're sure you want to go to court over this? We're prepared to pursue legal action." "Great," I said. "Then you won't mind if I submit these documents as part of discovery." I handed him a thick manila envelope. Inside were screenshots of the property listing, my notarized purchase agreement, the city's transfer of ownership records, and a letter from the municipal clerk confirming that the dock was no longer public or HOA property as of 3 weeks ago. The lawyer's face didn't twitch, but Karen leaned over his shoulder, reading fast. She blinked once, twice. "You bought it through a loophole," she said, voice climbing. "That's entrapment, not even close." "I'll escalate this to the county," she snapped. "Please do. I'd love for them to take a closer look at how your board's been operating, especially that little budget shuffle you made last fall. You know, the one that reallocated reserve funds into a private landscaping contractor whose address matches your nephew's." The lawyer tilted his head slightly toward her. That was when I knew I'd hit something solid. They left without another word. By Wednesday, the board posted a notice on the community bulletin that an unauthorized party had disrupted HOA operations and that a temporary access denial to the dock was being addressed through legal avenues. Neighbors started whispering. Some were angry, others were amused. A few came by my driveway just to shake my hand. That evening, I got a knock that wasn't angry or urgent. It was quiet. I opened the door to find Carla from 2 houses down holding a folder and a grocery bag full of soda cans. "I know you're in the middle of something," she said, "but I thought you should see this." She handed me the folder. Inside were copies of HOA vendor payments from the last 2 years' landscaping, security patrol, even a $2,000 decorative lighting consultation. Every receipt traced back to either someone related to a board member or a company that didn't show up in any business registry. "Where did you get these?" I asked. "My husband was treasurer until last March. He resigned after they pushed through that clubhouse renovation without a full vote. He kept copies of everything, said it didn't sit right." I offered her my porch chair. She sat and cracked open a soda. "They've been bleeding us for years," she said, "but no one ever fights them. You did." I spent the next few days organizing everything. I didn't go to the HOA, I went to the county fraud division. The investigator I met with, a no-nonsense woman named Detective Morgan, went through the documents with a yellow highlighter and a lot of muttering. She asked for digital copies, then told me to keep quiet while she did some digging. By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, the clubhouse parking lot was packed. People stood along the sidewalk, murmuring. The dock gate remained padlocked. Karen opened the meeting with her usual tight-lipped grin, trying to pretend nothing had changed. Then Detective Morgan walked in with 2 plainclothes officers and a file box. She didn't ask for permission. She walked straight to the front and placed the box on the table. "Under the authority of the County Financial Crimes Unit," she said, "we're executing a warrant to seize all HOA financial records dating back 5 years. Gasps swept the room. Karen's face turned the color of dry plaster. One of the other board members tried to protest, but Morgan cut him off. "Any attempt to hinder this investigation will be treated as obstruction." Karen stammered that this was all a misunderstanding, that any irregularities were clerical. Morgan didn't even look at her. "I've already spoken to 3 former board members, 2 contractors who never received full payment, and a vendor listed on your records who died in 2019. Sit down." The officers moved quickly, collecting laptops, printouts, and even the desktop computer from the office behind the podium. People started clapping quiet at first, then louder until the room echoed with it. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. Over the next week, the story spread fast. Local news ran a segment titled "Lakefront HOA Under Investigation for Financial Misconduct." Reporters camped out near the clubhouse. Someone started a group chat called Dock Watch, and people began sharing photos of the padlocked gate with captions like "The People's Pier." Residents started demanding a recall election. Turns out, most of the board had been in place for over 6 years, re-elected through unopposed ballots and obscure meeting notices. Carla and I helped organize a petition. We needed signatures from 50% of homeowners. We got 72% in 4 days. At the emergency assembly, Karen didn't show. Neither did 2 of the remaining board members. They submitted resignations by email, citing health concerns and hostile community sentiment. The last one, A quiet accountant named Lionel stayed just long enough to hand over the financial keys and walk out without a word. By the end of the month, we had a temporary oversight committee in place with full support from the county. They appointed me unanimously as interim chair until we could hold a proper election. The first thing I did, repealed every retroactive policy passed without full homeowner vote. The second, drafted a bylaw amendment requiring all board meetings to be live-streamed and announced at least 10 days in advance. No more backroom decisions. Then, with a signed majority vote from the community, I reopened my dock. Not the clubhouse dock, my dock. The one they tried to ban. I held a free barbecue on it. Burgers, hot dogs, a cooler full of soda. Carla brought potato salad. A retired vet named Tony brought his guitar. Kids fished off the side while adults talked about what they wanted the neighborhood to be. Someone asked me if I planned to keep the HOA going. I told them we'd keep the name, keep the structure, but we'd never again let it be a tool for control. We'd turn it into what it should have been from the start, a way to serve the people who actually lived here, not a playground for petty tyrants in visors with clipboards. And as for the clubhouse dock, still mine, still locked. By mid-June, the new HOA board was in place, and the transformation of Lakeview Shores was already rippling through the neighborhood. The days of backdoor dealings and secret fines were over, but the deeper we looked, the more rot we uncovered. What started with a few sketchy payments turned out to be the surface of something far worse. It began when Carla, now our official records officer, started digitizing the old expense reports. She flagged a series of payments labeled Community Emergency Fund Disbursement. The problem was, they weren't listed in any budget or referenced in any meeting minutes. These weren't small amounts, either. We were talking tens of thousands of dollars over a span of 18 months. I took one look at the recipient names and felt my stomach turn. One of them was a shell company registered to a PO box in Clearwater, which just happened to be the same city where the former HOA president's sister owned a vacation condo. Another was a supposed maintenance contractor who, according to the county clerk's website, had been convicted of tax fraud 5 years ago and wasn't licensed to operate in our state. Worse still, the largest payment, over $25,000, was labeled as legal retainer escrow, but the law firm listed didn't exist. I called Detective Morgan again. She met me at the community center, now under full homeowner control, and this time she brought a forensic accountant from the state's white-collar crimes unit. They stayed for 6 hours. By the time they left, they'd taken 3 boxes of documents, 2 hard drives, and a backup of the HOA's financial software. Morgan looked more serious than I'd ever seen her. "This isn't sloppy bookkeeping. This is organized embezzlement," she said flatly. "And based on the wire transfers we're seeing, it crosses state lines." I asked what that meant. "It means it just became a federal case." The following week, 2 unmarked vehicles from the Department of Justice parked outside the home of the former HOA vice president, a man named Greg Havorson. He didn't answer the door. They returned the next morning with a warrant. He tried to leave through the back gate and was escorted out in handcuffs. News vans showed up within the hour. Meanwhile, the community's mood shifted from cautious optimism to full-on rally mode. People who'd never spoken at meetings before were volunteering for committees, helping repaint signs, organizing events. We had neighbors bringing over boxes of archived newsletters, old email printouts, even photos from years past. Every piece helped build the timeline. Then one particular set of documents knocked the wind out of us. A woman named Denise, who lived near the East Side cul-de-sac, came forward with a folder she had kept from when her father lived in the neighborhood. He'd been one of the original board members, years before Karen took over. Inside were 2 notarized letters from 2015, both addressed to the HOA at the time, warning them about financial irregularities in the reserve accounts and urging a formal audit. Neither letter had ever been acknowledged, and one of the signatures on the bottom of the second letter. It belonged to the treasurer, who stepped down under mysterious circumstances a month later. According to Denise, he died in a car crash less than 2 weeks after that. The police had ruled it an accident. Detective Morgan took a copy of the file and said nothing. But 2 days later, she came back with a federal investigator from the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Apparently, the movement of funds from our HOA matched a pattern seen in several other fraud cases around the state, cases involving forged audits, fictitious vendors, and pressure tactics to silence dissent. That's when the subpoenas started flying. 3 former board members were pulled into federal court. Karen, who had disappeared from public view since her resignation, was officially named in a fraud indictment for misappropriating over $78,000 in community funds. The DOJ press release didn't mince words. Systematic abuse of homeowner funds, deliberate concealment of financial activities, and exploitation of legal structures for personal gain. The neighborhood was stunned. The day Karen was taken into custody, I stood on my porch and watched the black SUV drive past. She didn't look up. No one waved. Later that week, we held the first true community-wide vote in over a decade. With the help of a retired city clerk who volunteered to oversee the ballot process, we enacted a new charter. All financial records would be published quarterly. All vendor contracts required 2 non-board member signatures, and any board member found to have a conflict of interest would be immediately removed pending a vote. But there was one more thing we needed to settle. The clubhouse dock, the one I still owned, had become a symbol. Some wanted it returned to the HOA, others said I should keep it and do whatever I wanted. I called a meeting and told everyone I had a proposal. I didn't lock that dock out of spite, I told the crowd gathered at the Greenbelt Amphitheater. I did it because someone needed to draw a line, and now that we've taken the HOA back, that line's been drawn. I took out a folder and held it up. This is a deed transfer. I'm donating the dock back to the community under a new agreement. It'll be jointly managed by a rotating committee of homeowners, separate from the board. No one person gets control ever again. People stood and clapped. Some cheered. An elderly man from the North End saluted. Carla cried. 2 days later, we held a recommissioning ceremony. We cut a ribbon across the dock, and Tony played a slow, bluesy tune on his guitar as the sun set across the lake. Kids ran down the planks, casting lines into the water. A few folks brought folding chairs and watched with the kind of quiet satisfaction you only get when something's been earned the hard way. Still, the fallout from the investigation wasn't over. Federal agents discovered that similar fraud had occurred in 6 other homeowner associations across the state, all tied to a consulting group that had advised Karen's board on budget optimization strategies. That group was now the target of a multi-state lawsuit. Several of its executives had quietly resigned. Meanwhile, our neighborhood became a case study. A local university's urban policy department reached out, asking if we'd participate in a project documenting HOA reform. We agreed. Not out of pride, but because we wanted others to know what to watch for. As for me, I didn't plan on staying in charge. At the next election, I stepped down. I told everyone I was happy to serve, but leadership should rotate, especially in places where power had been abused. I went back to my dock, my original one, the one they tried to ban. I added 2 new posts, strung up some solar lights, and built a small bench at the end. A place to sit, breathe, and remember that even when the odds are stacked, one person with a plan, a backbone, and a file folder can change everything. And that's exactly what we did. It was early autumn when the subpoenas turned into court dates. The investigation had widened beyond our neighborhood, but Lakeview Shores remained the epicenter. Federal agents still came and went from the old HOA office, now cleared of personal effects and lined with folding tables. A sealed evidence box sat where Karen's framed photo used to hang. I only went back in for official business, but one afternoon, I found myself standing in the center of the room, staring at the faint outline on the wall where her leadership plaque had been. Carla stepped in behind me, holding a folder of newly collected witness statements. "They're going after them for conspiracy," she said, placing the documents on the table. "Wire fraud, mail fraud, falsification of public records. It's not just embezzlement anymore." I asked how many people were named. 11 so far, 4 from our board, the rest from the consulting company. They're trying to pin down whether they used HOA money to bribe city inspectors. I hadn't considered that, but it explained a lot, like how the board managed to bypass so many zoning restrictions without pushback. Carla said one inspector had already been fired. Another was cooperating under a deal. Then she handed me a photograph. It was a scanned copy of an internal email from the consulting company, dated nearly 2 years ago. It referenced suppressing homeowner interference through adjusted legal threats and included a line item labeled Dock Strategy LS Shores. I stared at that phrase for a long time. Dock Strategy, like it was a chess piece. The email attached a draft of a fine escalation system designed to create sufficient pressure for property concessions. I leaned back in the folding chair. They thought if they squeezed me hard enough, I'd give up the land. They did it before, Carla said. 2 other residents had their fences torn down after similar tactics. Both sold their properties within 6 months. That night, after everyone left, I sat on the bench at the end of my dock with a notebook. There were still things to sort through: permits, committee assignments, bylaws that needed rewriting, but I couldn't shake the image of that email. It wasn't about a dock, it was about control. It always had been. The following week, the federal grand jury returned its first set of indictments. Karen, Greg Havorson, and 2 of the consulting firm's directors were charged under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. RICO. That changed everything. The charges included conspiracy to defraud homeowners associations, use of interstate commerce facilities to commit extortion, and obstruction of justice. One of the consultants had tried to destroy records. Another had falsified invoices for non-existent repairs. The trial was scheduled to begin the first week of November. A regional news station set up outside the federal courthouse. Reporters buzzed around the steps like bees, jostling for statements. I was called to testify on the second day. The courtroom was colder than I expected. The judge, a lean woman with no tolerance for theatrics, kept the proceedings tight. When they asked me to recount the events that led to my purchase of the dock, I did exactly that: every step, every document, every ignored request for transparency. When they brought up the dock strategy memo, I watched Karen's attorney shift in his seat. She didn't look up once. Greg stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. On day 4, a former board secretary flipped. She took the stand and detailed how meeting minutes were doctored, budgets rewritten after homeowner votes, and financial reports pre-approved by the consulting firm before being presented. She described cash withdrawals from the HOA reserve account always under $5,000 to avoid federal reporting thresholds. One of those withdrawals paid for a planning retreat in Cancun. By week 2, the courtroom gallery was full. Local government officials came to observe. A representative from the state attorney general's office sat quietly in the 3rd row, taking notes. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. All 4 primary defendants were found guilty on multiple counts. Sentencing was scheduled for December. Each faced a minimum of 15 years. The judge revoked their bail and ordered immediate detention. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded the sidewalk. I didn't stop for interviews. I walked past them, down the block, and into a small diner where Tony and Carla were already waiting. They'd seen the verdict live streamed. Carla pushed a mug of coffee toward me. "It's over," she said. Tony nodded. "At least the worst of it." I didn't say anything for a while, just listened to the hum of the kitchen and the silverware on ceramic plates. Eventually, Carla asked, "What now?" I told them exactly what I'd been thinking. We rebuild, not just the rules, the trust. Back in Lakeview Shores, the atmosphere had shifted. The community wasn't just relieved, it was energized. People who once avoided HOA meetings were volunteering for committees. A group of retirees began auditing old vendor contracts, uncovering more discrepancies, nothing criminal, but enough to demand refunds from overcharged services. The new board, entirely elected by transparent ballot, included a former firefighter, a schoolteacher, and a marine biologist who'd recently moved in. No one had legal ties, no one had business interests in the area. They just cared. One of their first acts was to establish a rotating oversight council, 5 homeowners who would review any major financial decisions. No more unchecked authority. No more hidden agendas. As a gesture of good faith, the board presented a proposal to rename the clubhouse dock. Not after me, but after the event that changed everything. The community voted unanimously. They called it Resilience Pier. The new sign was handmade by a local artisan. Beneath the name, a simple motto: owned by all, controlled by none. At the dedication, I stood at the edge of the dock and watched neighbors gather on the lawn laughing, sharing food, telling stories. Kids ran barefoot across the boards. Someone brought a kayak. No one had to ask permission. No one feared a fine. As the sun dipped behind the hills, I realized I didn't feel like a watchdog anymore. I felt like a neighbor. Later that evening, I returned to my own dock, the one I built with my son. I sat on the bench we'd added, now sanded smooth from use. The lake was quiet, glassy. I could hear distant laughter from the community dock, carried on the breeze. I took out the last copy of the HOA's original charter, the one signed before any corruption had taken root. I folded it once, set it in a manila envelope, and tucked it into the lockbox where I kept the deed to my home. Not as a reminder of what went wrong, but as proof of what we fixed.